you've become increasingly disillusioned with the left.
Yeah.
I don't think so much with kind of left wing philosophy, but the direction that people who call themselves liberals, the wholesale abandonment of their commitment to human rights and to the Bill of Rights, and this kind of this strange, bizarre world that we find ourselves in, where you're getting where people are just saying, okay, it's okay for the government to take away our rights like this and that, and succumbing to fear and the utter wholesale abandonment of critical thinking by an entire generation of Americans. And I'd be interested just to hear kind of some of your general thoughts about that, about how did this happen? Because, doesn't it seem to you that we were all in civics lessons together, and that we knew that you can't take away freedom of speech, that censorship, even of Nazis, is a bad thing, and that if you censor anybody, that you're going to end up censoring everybody, and that the wholesale abandonment of due process of law, of government issuing rules by fiat without going through the democratic processes, without explanation, without science, and then the complete co-option of the press in this country, which is shocking to me.
Yeah.
You now have the liberal establishment, the New York Times, the CNN advocating censorship of dissent. How did that happen?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think you and I see eye to eye on the complete failure of the left to honor its legacy, right? Which for me is best represented by your uncle and your father, and also some movements to their left. My understanding of the left is that it's anti-war, it's anti-censorship, it's for workers' rights, it's for improving people's lives. The left today, what calls itself the left today, is completely consumed by identity politics, and is averse, to put it mildly, to any kind of mass unity, right? I mean, the idea of we the people has become hopelessly outdated and seemingly impossible, as the left, so-called left, sees itself as the guardian of particular identities, and the disparagement of other identities. Extremely hostile to all religion, hostile to the family, hostile to the nation, in favor of some bizarre amalgam of sort of globalist ideas. And most troubling of all, I would agree, is their tight embrace of censorship. You and I can remember the days when the ACLU defended the right of the Nazis to march in Skokie,
Yeah.
which was extremely controversial. But they were right. The Nazis had the right to demonstrate, even though they were Nazis. Now, I see a left that's fiercely committed to censorship and wants to see people shut down, deplatformed, fired, silenced. I mean, just this week, I think yesterday, there was a big cyber massacre of all kinds of channels on YouTube. Google basically took down many, many truth-seeking shows on the grounds that their views of COVID-19 and or vaccines are at variance with the claims of the World Health Organization. I mean,
which by the way is simply a sock puppet for a billionaire, Bill Gates, who
right.
It's not like the WHO has an independent identity. $1 billion of its $5.6 billion budget comes from one billionaire who's dictating his agenda through that agency. And then to have, that agency to be able to silence debate about critical areas of government policy that are, that directly contribute to his greater enrichment and wealth. Right. It's really quite extraordinary.
Well, it is. And I found that, I mean, like my colleagues at NYU, left academics seem to be incapable of grasping the enormity of what's gone down. I mean, the fact, for example, that Gates has spent, I think to date, $250 million on its strategic media partners, which include, the Washington Post,
BBC, the Washington Post, the New York Times, NPR, all of the, because the pharmaceutical company is already on the media. We know that. They abolished in 1997. They succeeded in abolishing this old rule that said pharmaceutical companies cannot advertise directly to consumers on TV because it would corrupt them. The AMA, everybody was against it. They got the FCC and the FDA to back off of that rule. And now, they're the principal advertisers on TV, and they're dictating. They're not only advertising, but they're dictating content. And so the networks have been taken away from us, but thank God we had independent news vehicles like The Guardian magazine, like NPR, like public television that we could rely on to tell us at least some aspects of the truth. And now we know that those are now wholly owned subsidiaries of the Gates organization, that Gates has moved in and taken all of those independent news vehicles and co-opted them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it used to be a solidly left position to oppose the control of media by commercial interests. I mean, the first drug crisis in American history was actually in the late 19th and very early 20th century, when patent medicines, were sold all over the country. Some of these things had cocaine in them. People had this problem called catarrh, some kind of phlegmy condition. It was widespread at the time. So all these people were taking the catarrh powders that were full of cocaine. They were taking nostrums that had morphine in them and alcohol in them. A lot of people in this country, including upper middle class lawyers and the like, ended up addicted to coke. They were coke heads. The press never, ever reported a word about the dangers of this problem, because the press got more money from the patent medicine industry, I think, even than from the cigarette industry at the time. And it wasn't until 1904 that Samuel Hopkins Adams wrote this fantastic expose in Collier's magazine, which did carry some patent medicine advertising, but its editor was brave enough to buck that. And he just laid the whole thing out. He demonstrated, first of all, that those medicines were toxic and addictive and didn't cure anybody of anything. And second of all, it was an exercise in media critique, because he explained that the press's failure to cover that threat to public health was due to their addiction to these advertising revenues. Okay, everybody on the left used to understand this. That's why, moving up to the 1934 Communications Act, there was a big push not to make American broadcasting advertising based. There was a move to make it something more like the British or Canadian model, where it would be license fees, be kind of publicly funded. Well, they lost that battle. They passed the Communications Act of 1934, which basically determined that radio broadcasting in the United States would derive its revenues from advertisers. And then they put in a big code, that station owners were supposed to do a certain amount of public interest programming, children's programming, religious programming. to kind of make up for that. But over the decades, and culminating in the 1996 telecom bill that Bill Clinton signed, all those regulations have been either watered down or eliminated.
Yeah,
And now
just to put it, let me add a kind of a footnote fact that I happen to know because I read a book about patent medicines and about the Rockefeller family, and the Rockefeller family, and you know, is regarded by many people who are students of his history as kind of the villains of shifting the you know, integrative medicine and the traditional healing arts to this, what they call allopathic medicine, which is the pharmaceutical paradigm. But John D. Rockefeller's father was a frontier patent medicine salesman who was selling those drugs that you're talking about, that, you know, selling cure-all drugs that they could clean your floor, wash your teeth, cure your headache, and it was just opium, you know, so, or morphine.
That's absolutely true.
But the big blow in, you know, 1934, when radio was at the dawn of commercial radio, the Congress understood that the communications, that whoever owned those communications was going to have tremendous impact on democracy. Because democracy relied on public education, and it would be, you know, they were terrified that that the uneducated masses would be seduced by a demagogue, and they would give up these hard-fought civil rights that were part of the U.S. Constitution. And in fact, you know, going back even further, one of the big battles at the beginning of American history was the battle between Madison and Adams on the one hand and Jefferson on the other, because Madison and Adams wanted to only give the franchise the vote to the educated class, which means landholding, so that if you didn't own land, you couldn't vote. And Jefferson wanted to give it to all people, not all people, but all white men, whether you're rich or poor or whatever. And Madison and Adams weren't anti-democratic. But they knew that uneducated people would quickly relinquish civil rights for short-term promises by demagogues, you know, a chicken in every pot, and, you know, and just accept censorship and we'll be okay. And Jefferson agreed with that. And he said, the remedy for that is not to deprive the public of their right to vote, but to forcibly educate them. And that's why we were the first country in the world to have mandatory public education. And Jefferson, on his gravestone, as you know, does not have author of the Declaration of Independence. He has founder of the University of Virginia, because he created this system where every county would put land aside to build educational institutions so that people would, you know, be compelled to go to school, and you would have an educated public, because without an educated public, you could not have a democracy. So in 1934, when radio was invented, they had the same debate in Congress, and they said, you know, people are going to be getting their education through the radio, and we don't want a tyrant to be able to go on the radio, which, you know, Hitler did 10 years later, and seduce the entire population. So they passed all these rules, which we call the Fairness Doctrine.
Right.
And those rules did what you said. They said you have to tell both sides of the story. You have to tell the truth. You can't tell lies on the radio. You can be sued for that. The FCC will yank your license. You have to do PSAs, and you have to devote a certain amount of prime time every day to telling the news. And it has to be the real news. It can't be headlines. It can't be, you know, gore and sex and gossip and Michael Jackson or whatever. It has to be the news that people need to understand in order to make rational decisions in a democracy. that's why when you and I were growing up in the 60s, we had John Chancellor and Walter Cronkite, and the networks hired these guys, the best news people in America, and they left them alone. The news divisions were not required to make money because the network made the money on the rest of the day. But the only way they could keep that license is if they gave high quality news every night at 6 o'clock. So they left the news divisions completely alone. And in 1986, Ronald Reagan abolished the Fairness Doctrine. The Supreme Court already upheld it. They said, if you advertise cars on your TV, you have to give equal time to people who have cancer or who have asthma. If you're advertising Mustangs, which use a lot of fuel, you need to give equal time to people who have cancer, and you need to give it to them for free. I mean, who have asthma, give it to them for free. It's called the Red Lion decision. And so the Supreme Court upheld it. And then Reagan, as a favor to the big studio heads who'd helped him get elected, and to the religious right that didn't want to give equal time and, wanted their own programming, he abolished the Fairness Doctrine. One of the things the Fairness Doctrine did is it said, you can't own a newspaper and a TV station in the same city. You can't have these national agglomerations. You have to have local control, because they wanted a diversity of news. They didn't want one company dictating what all Americans heard. Now we have, I think, 5 companies that own virtually 100% of the television networks and 99% of the radios and almost all of the newspapers and billboards. And, and they're telling us what to see and what to believe. And now you and I are living with the hangover of that, which is they're all telling us, masks work and don't ask questions, and social distancing work. And if you ask questions about that, we're going to censor you. So it's exactly what they predicted. Sorry to go on with that long dialogue.
No, it's really important. I mean, we are living through a propaganda drive, although the word drive seems inadequate to capture the scale of this thing. We're living through a propaganda drive that's unprecedented in human history, in its scale and in its sophistication. This is global. This is a global propaganda drive, and it involves nearly all the media, including the so-called left press. And if you look at who's funding them, the foundations that fund them, you understand why. They are all on board, okay? The corporate media, the so-called liberal media, the Guardian, the New York Times, the BBC, okay, and what we call the lockdown left. They are all reading from the same hymnal. They are all saying the same things, which is to say they're all telling the same lies. That's what's going on. And it's extremely difficult to get a word in edgewise, Those days you invoked a moment ago when there were sort of independent or at least disparate news outlets that would maybe compete somewhat with each other, those days are over. Now you're getting the same story everywhere, and then it gets filtered through social media. And the social media platforms then start censoring. YouTube takes stuff down. Twitter takes stuff down. Facebook has now, banned anti-vaccine posts and so on.